for the artist talk with Clare Samuel, talking about her project, featured in our Street View, which is our kind of multimedia exhibition space outside. And I've been talking to you guys about that in the comment sessions as well. Claire's going all the way over from Canada as well to do this talk, so we're very excited about this. Thank you so much, Claire. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Any questions, guys, as well, please feel free to interject and save to the end for Claire. It'd be really exciting. So thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. If you can't hear me at any point, just give me a signal like this. I don't have COVID, but I am having some issues with my vocal cords, so if I go a bit croaky, that's what's going on. So I grew up in Port Stewart, but I left when I was about 19, lived in England to Scotland, and like Ben said, now living in Canada. I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice in general, and then take you through a bit of the research and the process of making To Bend Into Shape, which is the work in the window there. And then if there's time, I'd like to show you some work that I've been working on the last couple of years and I'm currently working on. So my projects always relate to portraiture, even if they're not literally photographs of people, although they are in the work in the window. And I think at the core of my work is an interest in human relationships. So how critically important those are to us, but also how complex and difficult they often are. How we each have these entire inner worlds and we can never know the experience of another person's inner world. We have to coexist together in this exterior world. Sometimes I'm looking at this at a macro level, so how groups of people treat each other, and how systems and ideas that we've created can kind of divide people or unite people. And sometimes at a more micro level, how we affect each other and even kind of co-create each other, like the people that you've known through your life have contributed to who you are in kind of interpersonal interactions and relationships. So in To Bend Into Shape, I'm kind of looking at both the micro and the macro. My inspiration came from reading about the witch hunts, a period in history when certain types of people, overwhelmingly women, often old, often poor, often disabled, were violently persecuted by another group of people, primarily male clergy and lawmakers. And the work is very much about misogyny, the idea that women are to be distrusted, the hatred of women. But the images also became about subtle dynamics between individual women and between the feminine figures in the images and you, the viewer. So the witch trials are often thought of as a period of hysteria, and they're often identified more with a particular set of witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts in the US. And that's what the play by Arthur Miller, and it's also a film with Winona Ryder, are based on. And it's an amazing play, and it's a good film too, with a sort of an account of that kind of hysteria that can develop between people. But it's really was more of a metaphor for Arthur Miller's experience in the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was kind of described as a witch hunt to root out communists. And in a way, it actually doesn't feel about the experience of women being persecuted at all. It really reads as that kind of metaphor. And it doesn't kind of address the misogyny that obviously must have been there for the actual witch hunts to take place, that resulting in the execution of over 9 million people, primarily women. On a lighter note, this comic strip by Gemma Correll kind of illustrates the way that it was often aging women who were outsiders who would be accused of witchcraft. And as I'm sort of blazing into middle age myself, I'm very identified with this comic strip. If you can't read the speech bubble there, it's like she's forgotten the Lord's Prayer. This touches on beauty becoming an important aspect of what it means to be a woman, which didn't really develop until much more recently, really, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment. Obviously relates to the sort of familiars the witches were thought to have. And this relates to how many accused of witchcraft were actually healers, using herbs, many of which form the basis of medicines that we still use today. And then the sort of finale is quite quite upsetting. But it was really this book that was the impetus for my project and really inspired me to make work about this. Silvia Federici is a historian, and in this book she frames the witch hunts as a genocide against women, a project that was necessary to annihilate the power of the feminine, and also the aged, the poor, racialized, disabled, other, people different. Her argument is that this was totally necessary for the transition from capitalism from feudalism to succeed. The terror of those times and seeing what happened, serving to put women in their place, their new place as the wives and mothers of the working masses. So her historical analysis of the witch hunts is a Marxist feminist one. And for Marx, capitalism functions, and this is a very sort of like Marx for dummies, I'm not an academic, and it's sort of really boiling it down. But for Marx, capitalism functions by exploiting the working class, because unlike in earlier forms of subsistence and things where what you make and what you do, you get the fruits of that labor. Instead, your employer and your company gets the benefit of that. And the reason for it is that you don't own the means of production, which in the modern era would be the factory. So this is a quote from Federici. The body has been for women in capitalist society what the factory has been for male waged workers, the primary ground of their exploitation and resistance, as the female body has been appropriated by the state and men and forced to function as a means for the reproduction and accumulation of labor. So this relates to how capitalism would not be possible without the unpaid labor of women, because they produce the workforce, they feed and clothe the workforce, they support, they do all this work in the home. That at this time, this was the time when that was becoming normal, like being told that that was normal. Previously, men and women had not actually been considered so different, and many did tasks in the fields. It was very strange reading this book and kind of her argument that women actually had more power during this time. You wouldn't think it, but the woodcut on the left there is showing women working in what was called the commons. So this was land that nobody owned, but anybody could actually sort of gather, berries or plant things there or have their animals there. And this was the time that land was beginning to be taken up by the state, and it was no longer owned by everybody. And then on the right there is sort of this idea of witches giving babies to the devil and things, because it was also a time when the population became quite low, which meant that the workforce had a lot of power, which the ruling classes did not want. So reproduction and sort of putting women in their place as the means of reproduction was important. On the left here is a diagram showing where women could have sort of hidden nipples that would be used to feed the devil. And then on the right, it's burning at the stake. So this is the time that beliefs about the impurity and dangerousness of the female body in general kind of really took off. And this book, the Malus Maleficarium, is usually translated as the Hammer of Witches. This really kind of set off the extreme fervor of the witch trials, and it contains all kinds of incredibly imaginative stuff, a lot of it very misogynist. So the quote here, witches who in this way sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn. Like really crazy stuff, but also very much serving to make men afraid of women and therefore want to control and punish them. And then other research I did was more recent people engaging with this. So this is a podcast where they're really investigating specifically in Scotland what happened with the witch trials. And it's run by, I think they're both lawyers, and they're really looking at it from a legal perspective, that these trials were, bogus, and that there should be like an official government apology from Scotland to these women, and that there should also be some kind of a monument to this wrongdoing. So that's super interesting if you want to learn more. And then this was a documentary from the 90s, where I got a lot more sort of, again, more practical, straightforward kind of information, less the kind of overarching academic ideas about it. So here, as I mentioned before, like a lot of what these healers were doing was actually scientific, but this was the time when, as well, midwives had always been the ones that dealt with births, and this was the time where their power was being taken away, and the male doctor was becoming the person that helped with birth. So I knew I wanted to do a project about this. I knew I didn't want to literally recreate historical events. I tried shooting in a lot of different ways. I'm kind of too embarrassed to show you like the process work from it, but this is the first image where I felt like this is doing something that I wanted to do. My idea was that the neck would be exposed in this way to reference what I had read, that initially witches were strangled for execution and then burned, and then later this was considered too merciful, so they were then burned alive. So that vulnerability of the neck. And then this was the next one that I took that I felt sort of really worked. So this was based on reading that, the power of hair, and there's so much about this strange power of women's bodies in general in these lores. And in Scotland, ideas that not just witches used hair, but no sister should comb her hair at night. If she had a brother at sea, she would be endangering him if she did something with her hair. And this one, it was interesting because this was the only one on the contact sheet that I felt worked. I have quite a low sort of hit rate. I tend to shoot a lot until I get what I want. And this one, the wind just blew her hair in just the right way at the right time. This is the one that made me realize that the project was going to be kind of about beauty as well. I don't know if you can really see on the screen there, but she has some facial hair that was just, she sometimes bleaches it, she sometimes doesn't, she hadn't at the photo, but then I realized that it was doing something really interesting. And then here, of course, her white hair is kind of like blazing through the dyed part, and her being like a larger bodied woman, but I think she looks really beautiful and really powerful. And so I started reading this book written in the 90s. And this is how, not so much women's actual bodies, but images of women's bodies are used to oppress them. And her argument is that after the gains made in first wave feminism, women obtaining the vote, and second wave feminism in the 70s of things like birth control and divorce and things like that, that the extreme standards of beauty and how important they became to us as a culture were a backlash against that, again, to sort of keep women in their place. Not in a sort of concerted conspiracy, somebody around a table like decided that, but that a kind of undercurrent of culture, like something had to kind of like tamp that down. And it's very much to do with photography as well. This is a time when, images become everywhere, and people have never before this time been seeing so many images. So a quote from the book: "The beauty myth is always actually prescribing behavior and not appearance. Competition between women has been part of the myth so that women will be divided from one another." And I mentioned in the voiceover on the street view there, like think about like beauty cream adverts and how they're kind of promising something magical and transformative. There was actually the belief that witches had this flying unguent or flying ointment that they rubbed over themselves and it made them fly, and the things that products are kind of promising us today are sort of doing the same thing. This one's called Transformation, and it's got like a sort of a vibe of like a hair advert, but very different. As an older woman, it's gray hair, it's, the natural world. And I started photographing multiple figures, which I haven't really done before in the same frame, because I was interested in that idea of how women relate to each other and how it's harder to relate to each other in a certain culture. This one I've called Ritual. I was thinking of beauty rituals and regimes, and Naomi Wolf in her book does talk about how it's not all oppressive necessarily, all aspects of beauty, like the two painting each other's nails. It's a way that women connect as well, and like wanting beautiful colors, wanting decoration is not necessarily bad. It's divorcing it from this idea that you have to look a certain way. I also became interested in the public and private congregation of female bodies throughout history. During the witch hunts, female friendship began to be discouraged. Previously just normal for them to be chatting in the fields or in the commons. But this is the time when the word gossip obtained its negative meaning. Previously that word just meant a female friend. This image came out of witnessing an interaction at an exhibition opening where two close friends were talking to me and another person, and then in the middle of the conversation, one of them just reached out and fixed the lipstick of the other, which I thought was such a sort of intimate gesture and kind of loving, but then could also be seen as sort of policing, like you don't want people to see you with your lipstick smudged and kind of that whole, you have to look perfect, you have to look right all the time. And then I started thinking about fairy tales and how women's bodies are portrayed in those, how they have these sort of magical powers and symbolic element. So hair, obviously, in Cinderella, you know, Disney has so many of them. The Snow Queen and the jealousy of not being the fairest of them all. So the kind of how women's bodies are sort of dangerous and powerful. And Angela Carter has dealt with fairy tales and folk tales kind of having a particular feminist spin on them, and also really bringing out the violence and shining a light on the misogyny that is there in the original tales. So she did a whole sort of suite of revamped tales that had originally been quite violent and bloody, but had been sort of sanitized for the Victorian era. She kind of went back to the source material, and then also gave the heroines kind of a lot more power. This image, relates to sort of like blood, again, the vulnerability of the neck, but the idea came from the story, The Green Ribbon. There's also other forms of it, the Black Ribbon, it's been told in different ways. But it's the story of a woman who meets this guy, and she always wears this ribbon around her neck, and he's entranced with her, and they fall in love and they get married, but she'll never take the ribbon off, even though it will clash with her wedding dress and even when she's asleep at night, and she'll never tell him about her life before he met her. But he keeps at her to kind of like, why won't you tell me, why won't you take it off just this once? And she's always sort of like, you'll be sorry if I do, you'll be sorry if I do. And then one night, years into the marriage, he can't stand the curiosity anymore, and he takes it off while she's asleep, and her head falls off. Everyone's face, I love it. And just this idea that the only thing holding her together is this decoration, and that she can't be who she really is. She can't tell him about her past before she'll disintegrate. This image was also inspired by that story. So this is two twins, a male and a female, and so the female has the matching ribbon around her neck. And then I actually read this after I'd done those photographs, so it wasn't an inspiration, but it was sort of a validation. This is an amazing book of short stories, and one of them is based on that story, The Green Ribbon, and in it, all the girls are born with different ribbons on different parts of their body, and it kind of symbolizes their oppression. So the title "To Bend and to Shape" came from the fact that the word witch comes from an Indo-European root word "wick," meaning to bend or to shape, which could refer to materials, reality, or consciousness. So I thought about so-called women's work, like transforming fabric into clothing, repairing, bringing things together. And I thought about the power that it takes to imagine the world differently, without misogyny, for example, or to change other people's perspectives, as well as how female bodies adapt through life, aging, and in order to create life, transforming dramatically, and how beauty standards tell us to shape, control, and transform ourselves. So this one, eating, something very loaded for women because body size is under so much scrutiny. In all of these where there's two figures, I want the relationship between them to be sort of quite ambiguous. I mean, it's fairly obvious those are her children. It could be a mother and daughter, it could be two friends. And then here it is a mother and daughter. And in this one, kind of hoping to create this tension between, is she protecting her from the gaze of the camera, or is she sort of competing for that gaze? And the various touches in the photograph, are they tender and loving? Are they protective? Are they sort of interfering and antagonistic? And then in this final one, alluding to the many women burned with the ashes of the fire. And then I have a video piece which I didn't include out there because I just didn't think it would fit with the format. But this is displayed in the gallery, and I usually show it with these stills. And it's very short, so I'll just play it and I'll just talk over the first little bit. But it very much relates to the interest in the congregation of women's bodies at that time, and is also inspired by a short story, which I'll tell you about in a moment. It's very much a sort of moving image rather than a film, so you kind of go in and out of the gallery and see it.